Of all the things that certainly needed to be addressed by CB Cebulski when he took over Marvel Comics, there's one thing that he kind of did pretty mostly decently. There are far less Marvel Comics writers going out there and berating the fans. Far less Marvel Comics artists going out there and berating fans. That is certainly one thing that has gotten for the better. It's not perfect, but it's not as bad as it used to be. But there is one OG comic creator troll that used to be the worst person in the world when it came to fans. His name is Dan Slott. It's very well documented. If you go over to my friend Doug Ernst's channel back in the day, not only on his YouTube channel, but certainly on his blog, he would talk about the way that Dan Slott would go out there and try and intimidate, insult, question fans, especially on message boards back in the day. He was the first guy to go out there, and if you said anything about a Spider-Man run, he would ridicule you in public and try to get people to dogpile on you, to basically to silence people that had an opinion that his Spider-Man wasn't very good. Dan Slott, aka Slotto Blocktavius, is very notorious for it, so it wasn't the most surprising thing in the world that we got this recent article on the Popverse talking about him berating fans. But there is this little piece in there that is very surprising. Apparently, Marvel Comics kind of went along with it. At least their leadership did. In fact, they might have instructed him to do some of this stuff. But this is the article from the Popverse titled, Marvel's longest-running Spider-Man writer Dan Slott says he berated some fans who questioned the death of Peter Parker in public. And it states, if you've ever wondered what happens when you kill one of the most beloved characters in pop culture, Dan Slott is here to give you a pretty clear picture. Most comic book fans are familiar with Slott as a Spider-Man writer who killed Peter Parker and whisked us all on a storyline where Doc Ock became Spider-Man, known as Superior Spider-Man. And as popular as Superior Spider-Man was, fans were still approaching Slott over whether or not Peter Parker was actually dead or not. And that makes a whole lot of sense. Peter Parker is the flagship superhero for Marvel Comics. He is Spider-Man. And if you kill him off, people are going to ask you, when are you bringing him back? Because obviously you're going to bring Spider-Man back. He's not going to stay dead forever. You do have to have Peter Parker in the goddamn comic book. Certainly you kill off heroes from time to time, but they always come back. The expectation when Dan Slott killed off Peter Parker was that Peter Parker would come back. Not that Doc Ock would sit in Peter Parker's body forever. I do not believe anybody in their right mind ever thought that that was like a permanent status quo change. Yet still, this guy decided to go out there and insult people, known for his arrogance. How could you possibly question me about something that I'm clearly going to undo? Why would you ever want to know when this was going to be undone? And you can tell that Dan Slott has a real contentment for the fandom themselves. The only reason anybody in this world knows who Dan Slott is, and not many people do, is because he wrote Marvel Comics Spider-Man. That is literally his entire claim to fame. The only reason his name means anything in the lexicon of anything, whether it be pop culture, comic books, Marvel Comics, or anything, is because the fans supported him, whether they liked the run or not. They still bought it in his run on Amazing Spider-Man. You would think that he would be very thankful, but no, he gets to WonderCon and he explains exactly how he felt about these people that were questioning him on the death of Peter Parker and when Peter Parker was going to return, stating, I did this with convention after convention, and someone would come up and go, when is Peter coming back? And then you go, he's never coming back. And they're like, oh, and then 20 minutes later, someone asks you the same question. So in order to stop that, when I was at conventions, the first time someone would ask me that, I would lean down the line and go yelling, Peter Parker is dead. He's never coming back. It's Otto Octavius. And I could spare myself a couple of hours without hearing the question. Slott also brought this approach with him when he was a guest at a convention in Mexico City, stating that he knew just enough Spanish to get across the same message to fans. Now, the question is, do any fans who got books signed by Slott at this time remember hearing him yell, Peter Parker is dead down the line? So gleefully bragging about the fact that he didn't want to entertain the question. He didn't appreciate the fact that the question was coming out, even though it was quite clear that it was never going to be a permanent status change, that Peter Parker would return because he had contempt for the fans. He was so arrogant that he decided to go out there and insult him. I won't even address your question. I'll pre-address it by yelling at you down the line, and I won't even address it with you personally, even though you probably spent $50 or even more, because I'm the Spider-Man writer, to actually get my autograph at a convention. That's this dude's mentality. This is a mentality that was quite prevalent through Marvel Comics for a long time, and I think is still there. And obviously, we're importing it over to DC Comics now because who doesn't need that magic elixir, that secret sauce that is Dan Slott on fucking Superman? Nobody, not even Dan Slott fans, ever asked for Dan Slott on Superman. But that's a topic for another day. But that's just who this guy is. Literally, as an ambassador of Marvel Comics, the Spider-Man writer goes down to Mexico City. What do we know about Mexico City when it comes to the comic book market? Mexico City, Mexico loves Spider-Man. In fact, they had their very own version of Amazing Spider-Man with its own canon because they were that enthusiastic about Spider-Man and they were that supportive of it that they got their very own storylines that portrayed a different version of Peter Parker where Gwen Stacy basically never died. As an ambassador to Mexico City, representing Marvel Comics, he would go down there and insult those fans as well. Yell at them, Peter Parker está muerto. Apparently, Dan Slott was literally yelling that at conventions in Mexico City while he was representing the biggest American brand in comic books. And we wonder why comic books just don't sell worldwide anymore. Maybe you set morons like Dan Slott out there as representatives for the company, but also for the entire industry to other countries, and he went out there and berated them as well, acting like a complete jackass because he is the OG fucking fan hater when it comes to American comic book creators. And he's obviously very proud of that. He gave himself the moniker Slotto Octavius. This isn't something I made up or Doug made up or really anybody made up. In fact, you remember Jimmy from Comic Works? Really good guy. I love Jimmy. Used to have him on the channel. He's gone with a different route, not really talking about comic books anymore. But he used to be the biggest Dan Slott apologist in the world, would claim, oh, he's super great, even though everyone was like, nah, his Spider-Man run is definitely played out. It's time for him to move on. But he loved Dan Slott for reasons I don't know. He had the temerity to question Dan Slott in public. Well, it wasn't even really in public. I think it was like on a chat board or in some type of a messaging format. And Dan Slott literally went into like a private DM room with Comic Works, one of his biggest supporters, and typographically berated him and told him that he wasn't allowed to question his decisions or his writing competence ever. And that was the day that Jimmy from Comic Works wasn't a fan of Dan Slott anymore. I wonder why Jimmy is not covering comic books on YouTube anymore. And Jimmy, if you're watching this, I know I just shared your story, but I'm rooting for you, I'm praying for you, and I hope that you're doing well in your recovery right now. Definitely rooting for you right here in the Philippines, and I hope to hear from you very soon. But that's the kind of contemptible bastard that Dan Slott is and was. And the worst part, because it's in this article and Dan Slott addresses that, is that apparently it was all greenlit and okayed by Marvel themselves. At WonderCon 2025, Dan Slott revealed in his spotlight panel that he had an efficient way of handling repeated questions concerning Peter Parker's fate. Slott noted that he was instructed by Marvel Editorial to tell him any fan who asked him if Peter was going to come back to life, that he was dead for good, and that he was never going to be resurrected. They told him the message to send out there, and they knew the way that he was addressing people in Mexico City and other conventions. They knew the way that he was talking to people on message boards, and they okayed it all. That is bullshit. Now, that would not be under EIC, CB Cebulski, the current EIC at Marvel Comics. That would have been a Joe Quesada era thing, probably going into the Axel Alonso era. Certainly would have been okayed and greenlit by Tom Brevoort, who's also berating fans these days, telling them not to read books anymore. Also would have been okayed by somebody like a Dan Buckley, the president of Marvel Comics. But they knew this guy was being a jackass. They knew he was being arrogant. He was insulting people, that he wasn't being a good ambassador, not only for Spider-Man, but certainly Marvel Comics or American comics in general, was going out on a world stage, embarrassing himself, making himself look like a jackass, and they fucking greenlit the entire thing. And that is an enormous problem with Marvel Comics. It has gotten a little bit better under CB Cebulski, but they still haven't reined these guys in. And they still don't have people out there really showing any type of appreciation for the fans that have stuck around through 5 years of what have been just abysmal stories. There are a couple of stories that have been okay, but for the most part, what we're getting at Marvel Comics these days is absolute trash. Every single Marvel writer, editor, artist, letterer, executive, fucking janitor should be out there kissing every Marvel reader's hairy beanbag, thanking them for sticking around through this terrible time of creative. But this is the mentality that they have. They're better than us. They can berate us. They can talk down to us. We're not allowed to ask questions about something as simple as, well, you killed Peter Parker off. He's no longer in the book. He's Spider-Man. When is he actually coming back? Can we expect it anytime soon? That is a very reasonable question. Not according to Marvel Comics, and they unleashed Dan Slott, Octavius himself, and gave him the green light to go out there and talk shit to fans to their faces for years upon years. And we wonder why so many people have been turned off to the industry, why so many people felt it was good to walk away. And Dan Slott, to this day, is going to comic book conventions fucking bragging about it. Hopefully it'll get better soon. Maybe we'll get some actual adults in charge of these companies sometime soon, and we can rein these assholes in. And maybe, just maybe, we can start healing the American comic book industry and things can get better again. If you like this kind of conversation, this honest perspective on comic books, because you can't get it very many places these days, and you would like to support the mission of Think Critical YouTube, shining a light on comic books, everything good, bad, and in between, and keeping the message of comic books and the greatness of comic books moving forward, the best place to do that is on Think Critical Patreon. There's a link in the video description. Button right here. You support us there, you become part of the family, help keep the lights on, keep the videos flowing forward, and you get awesome podcasts in return. I hope to see you there very, very soon.